Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. Korea celebrates National Liberation Day next week to commemorate the end to Japanese colonial rule in 1945. But here we are, nearly 70 years later, and many long-standing issues remain between the two neighboring countries. On today's After 10, we are joined by Professor Chip Pitts of Stanford University to take a look at the issues and perhaps some solutions. Professor Pitts, thank you very much for being on the program.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me, Scott.
Now, you're an expert in international law with an emphasis on post-war compensation, human rights, corporate responsibility. Before we delve into this very complex topic that we're going to be discussing here, could you please first introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Well, I've taught for many years public international law, which is the relationship between states classically, and also private international law, including international business transactions, economic globalization. And about 15 years ago, I noticed this starting to really converge into what I've called a new global law that includes not just international between nations, but also non-state actors. So corporations which make law and are subject to it globally at every level, rebel groups, and other non-state actors like organized criminal cartels, drug cartels, that sort of thing.
Much of what we're going to be talking about today stems from a 1965 treaty between Korea and Japan that normalized relations 20 years after the colonial period. This treaty for us and your overall interpretation of what it is and what it does.
Sure. Well, there was the San Francisco Peace Treaty, basically, that ended the war formally. And then in 1965, there were some open issues, mainly economic and commercial issues. And this 1965 Japan-Korea agreement was the centerpiece of the efforts to try to clarify those claims and resolve them. But it did focus on commercial claims, economic development. In fact, right in Article 1, it says in the agreement that this is in order to help the economic development of Korea.
One of the controversies is something about a right to claim, which does deal with economic cooperation. Japan and Korea both have expressed a willingness to maybe re-examine or even renegotiate this clause. Can you give us a sense of why it is so controversial?
Sure. And the reason is that despite the primarily economic and commercial nature of the agreement, the Article 2 of the agreement, the 1965 agreement, has very broad language that says that Korea, on behalf of its nationals, juridical persons, corporations, as well as individuals, presumably, gives up all right, property, and interest. Now, the question is whether that's property rights, strictly economic claims in particular, or does that include individual human rights violations? And if it is the latter, then that would mean that those subject to forced labor, sexual slavery, and forced conscription, therefore have had their rights waived by Korea's government at the time. And that's problematic because, of course, at the time, in 1965, you had the Park Chung-hee government, an autocratic government. So there are questions about whether the autocratic government could give up the rights of individuals. And I think the weight of authority is now shifting quite decisively to questioning whether that could be done. The questions arise, of course, in the overall context of the history between Japan and Korea. You know, Japanese colonial occupation between 1910 and 1945. Some pretty egregious violations of which happened then. And then the gross injustices that were committed by all sides, but especially by Japan, against Chinese nationals, Korean nationals, other victims of Southeast Asia, forced labor, sexual trafficking.
Right. So we're talking about two interpretations here of this particular clause, is what you're saying. Basically.
Exactly.
Right.
And The interpretation, even here in Korea, was at first pretty silent because Japanese, of course, practice was to completely deny and hide its involvement in these forced labor, sexual slavery actions until the 1993 Kono Statement, where the Chief Cabinet Secretary in Tokyo acknowledged in a very ambiguous fashion, but acknowledged that Japan's army was involved in this very, very broad system of sexual slavery that encompassed somewhere between 50 to the estimates I've heard of 200,000 victims. And so Japan, having concealed these claims, it's very difficult for them to say now that this agreement addressed and resolved those claims. But they're saying that still.
And the other issue, too, is that they would say that the agreement called for compensation, that they met that requirement. Right. And some might say they also sidestepped, though, the legal and ethical responsibilities that may have entailed as well. Is that a proper way to look at that?
I think that's right. The compensation that was referenced in the agreement was really critical, without a doubt, to Korea's economic development. It was about $500 million, $300 million of which were in goods and services and cash payments from Japan, and another 200 of which were ongoing assistance and that sort of thing. But the problem is that was critical to Korea's economic development. It allowed Korea to participate at that time, 65, to start adding labor to the Japanese production chains. You remember this is when Japan was starting to really come on strong, and then Korea followed, of course, in the succeeding couple of decades. But that really wasn't aimed at redress of individual human rights claims for slavery, forced labor. It was a universal benefit to Japan and to Korea for the economic development of both countries as the global production chains were integrated. But as you say, it didn't explicitly deal with ethical or legal issues. In fact, as near as I can tell, the ethical and legal issues, human rights issues, didn't even come up in the negotiations.
My question would be, does Japan have a point there? Did it cover what they are saying it did cover, and is it feasible to actually move on from there?
Yeah, I think if it weren't for the revelations of exactly what happened, and even Kono himself, who did the apology in 1993, has said Japan needs to take greater responsibility here. But the international community as a whole has actually shifted position on this issue. I think most people, not having known the scope and the scale of the system of forced labor and sexual slavery, they probably would have read the little language broadly. But the language does not refer to any kind of forced labor, slavery, human rights violations of any kind. And there are even substantial legal questions about whether two nations can absolve individual human rights victims of their rights to compensation and to remedy for what are actually fundamental rights, especially fundamental rights of the sort we're talking about here, which are some of the strongest rights in the world. The right to be free from slavery, from forced labor, which is tantamount to slavery, from forced conscription, from systematic rape. I mean, this is what was happening in these Japanese war brothels, the so-called comfort women, euphemistically it's been called, but it's actually quite now well known to be a system of enforced sexual slavery. So there are positivistic, formal legal arguments where you can read the language broadly, and Japan does so, saying this absolves us from all claims. But as a drafting matter, if they intended to get rid of those claims, they would have actually expressly said so. And in fact, Japan has done that in its other post-war settlement claims, like the one with the UK or Canada or Greece. Just as the Norwegian-German settlement agreement, for example, the rights of individuals and their right to compensation was expressly referenced. There's no reference to human rights or any of these crimes in this agreement.
Legally speaking, then, in the crux of all of this, what does that mean, I guess, for Japan's position?
Well, I think it means Japan has a problem. They continue to do what they've been doing for decades now, which is to equivocate, basically, to basically say, on one hand, we are remorseful, we're sorry for what the women and the forced laborers experienced, but this agreement absolves us from all claims. Now, that doesn't take into account that slavery was a strongest norm of the international community, what's called a jus cogens norm, one that would exist even in the absence of a treaty or in the presence of a treaty saying that slavery was okay. You just can't do that. And that's been the case for a long time. There are many treaties, and it was a matter of customary law, both when the events happened during World War II and at the time of this 1965 agreement. And so I think that it's a little disingenuous for Japan to say, we didn't know this was illegal. You know, they had actually signed the Forced Labor Convention in 1932. They had actually been aware of the Hague Convention in 1907, which prohibited enforced rape as a war crime. So it's difficult for them to now say, we only signed the Civil and Political Rights Convention in 1979, so that's when our obligation starts. No, it was a matter of customary law. Slavery has been illegal for a long time.
What recourse does Korea, does China, do other nations that have been victims of Japanese colonialism, what recourse do they have?
Well, I think that they need to look for creative ways to solve this problem. I mean, it's truly not in the interest of Japan or Korea to continue this conflict. And as you know, it's extremely emotional. And when things take on an emotional life of their own, it becomes very difficult to settle a conflict on rational grounds. And yet, that's precisely what they need to do. My personal opinion is that they should not use the framework of this agreement. I think it's quite clearly incomplete. It's been poorly executed to the extent that it has been executed, which is not very well. And so I think that they actually need to have a new initiative. Now, there were talks that have started, including last June, but the Japanese politicians and the Korean politicians tend to have recurrent provocations of the other side. You know, for example, when President Lee Myung-bak went to the Dokdo Island, no South Korean president had done that. And it would have actually, I think Korea's claim is stronger to that island historically, but Japan claims it too, the Takashima Islands, I believe they call them. Right. To go there, to be the first Korean president to do so, needlessly provoked Japan. Similarly, when you've got Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, calling into question whether the Kono statement was an acceptable, justified apology for the sexual slavery system, that's not helpful. When you have the Osaka mayor in Japan say, well, any soldier would need rest, so they had to have a system like this. It was necessary. That's not helpful. Sure. So the first thing they need to do is stop the needless provocation of each side. Japan
is, why not take these steps? Why not, take the correct steps, admit what you've done, and try to move on and make those wrongs right, so to speak. What does Japan have to lose by doing that?
Well, I think that's the crux of the question. Why isn't Japan doing this? It's in their interest. It's in the interest of Japan and Korea, especially as China's coming on, to be their natural allies. They've got this long connection together. They've got historical tensions and an ambiguous relationship, to be sure. But the modern geopolitical situation, I think, makes it urgent for Japan and Korea to actually play a leadership role in the region and the world. So far, they're not playing that role. They've only got something like 18% of their seats on the international financial and governance bodies, when by all rights they should have 26% or more. So I think the time has come for them to stop pandering to their domestic constituencies. That's the problem, is that Prime Minister Abe's base of support depends on this sort of nationalistic, aggressive rhetoric. And unfortunately, that's leading them to make some dubious decisions, like maybe remilitarizing Japan, changing the Constitution. And this is all part and parcel of that. So when President Obama visited Abe just a couple of months ago, he did mention that, you need to tone it down a little bit. And then after that, I don't think it was a coincidence that the Japanese government said, we are not going to revisit the Kono statement. We're going to let our apology stand. But despite that, these issues persist. And as a result, President Park from Korea and Prime Minister Abe have not had the summit meeting that they need to have in order to address this and the whole panoply of important issues affecting Japan, Korea, the region, and the world. Issues ranging from climate change to all the other major global issues, the territorial conflicts in the sea and so forth.
We're talking about the diplomatic tensions. There are also things happening on a civilian level, I guess we could say. In addition to the forced sexual enslavement of women, Koreans were also forced to do menial labor without compensation in Japanese factories during the colonial era. We've seen a number of civil suits come up in recent years, filed by victims and their families looking for that compensation. How do you see them playing out, and can we learn anything perhaps from other cases in the past?
We certainly can. I mean, this has been one of the biggest trends in the last few decades, and it's why I've focused a lot of my teaching on corporate responsibility and corporate accountability for human rights violations. Because the reality, Scott, is that in this uber-transparent world we have, where formal media like your network, but also social media, alternative journalists, any individual with a camera or camera phone can film these violations. And so it just doesn't make sense anymore to deny them. And one of the big trends sweeping the world is that corporations and governments have been held accountable for abuses. So there are many precedents now, ranging from forced labor cases to toxic pollution cases. One major one that's very relevant here is the Holocaust litigation, which was multi-billion. It was ultimately about a $5 or $6 billion settlement involving the German government, the US government, other governments and players, NGOs, but also, and significantly, German industry, which contributed a substantial amount, about half of that amount, to a big fund to compensate victims and truly address the issues in a holistic fashion. So that's the sort of thing I think that needs to happen here.
In terms of these particular cases from the Korean plaintiffs, how do you foresee them playing out? Do they have a strong case in this realm?
I think so. Yeah. I actually would not have said so until some recent decisions by the Korean Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, both of which have recognized that Japan has committed crimes, the sexual slavery system, but also the forced labor system in general, including industrial workers, and the forced conscription. And these atrocities need to be addressed. And so the historical understanding of the Korean courts was to basically not address them or to defer to the Japanese position that these are handled by the 1965 agreement. In recent years, that's changed. As the cases are brought, there's an acknowledgement of the substantive harm. And the reaction now is that either the legislature in Japan must address it, as some Japanese courts have said as well, or the Korean government has a duty to engage in this negotiation process, either through informal negotiation, formal arbitration, or mediation, something in between. And I think that's why you see the talks that have been occurring. And that's why it's so unfortunate when you have provocative actions by one side or the other that derails the talks. So I think as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that's very true here. The thing is that the victims don't have time. These people are, literally, I've had some of the comfort women come to my class to speak to my students, and it's extremely moving. It's tragic, but it's the high point of the semester because the kids see the courage that these women have in having been through hell, essentially, having been raped many times a day, and getting up and having the courage to now speak out about it. So with their transparency, they're bringing the issues to light. I think that things have changed and justice will follow. Let's just hope that it's sooner rather than later.
When you look at justice, are you confident that we're moving in that direction now?
I think we are. The only question is timing, and that's why, I would personally advocate continued U.S. pressure. Already, the House of Representatives of the U.S. has passed Resolution 121 in 2007. That was actually attached to a spending bill from Congress as a whole this year. And so I think that the position of the U.S., the position of the UN, special rapporteurs, the Human Rights Committee, many other nations, NGOs, leaders have weighed in. I think it's time for Japan especially to get the message that it's in their vital economic and security interest to take the right position on this. But I think it's up to us, all of your viewers, you and me, to actually keep the pressure on as well. And I'm glad that you're covering this on your show today.
That's a great question then. How do you do that? How can an individual put pressure on the parties to do the right thing here?
Well, literally, every Wednesday the comfort women appear before the Japanese embassy, and they're engaged in peaceful protest. The reason it's acute that we must resolve this quickly is that if, as John F. Kennedy said, if you don't have peaceful evolution, you'll have violent revolution. And sadly, already both in Japan at the shrine and at the embassy here, there have been grandchildren of the comfort women who've taken to throwing gasoline bombs and so forth. So violence is happening, and we don't want to see that. So the thing to do is to join some of the groups, the Pacific Survivors Group. In Japan, the Japanese citizens there are quite good. JROED, the Japanese Research for War Crimes Documentation Center. I would support those groups financially, get on the website, be informed on the issues as a first matter, and then go to the protest on Wednesday. I would suggest doing that. I've said to my students, go there, see what you think about it. Some students have written term papers on it, and they've actually become engaged on Facebook, on Pinterest, Instagram, on social media, Twitter, so that they're actually making their voices known, so that this positive trend, both in the law and among the governments of both parties, continues, and we'll hopefully see some results in the near future.
Looking at both countries, what you think they could be doing, should be doing to get us there. Let's start with Japan.
Well, again, the first thing Japan needs to do is make sure that they don't, play to their worst instincts, that the politicians take their power, and I think this is true of all the leaders involved, and I think we all need to be leaders on this issue, not from what's in their short-term self-interest, playing to the masses on emotional issues and conflict. But once the conflict exists, they should surface the conflict, as here, but then address it by being other-oriented, basically. So make sure that there's historical truth. Make sure there's no attempt to, as there has been historically in Japan, to deny what happened and change Japanese textbooks. Now, I'm from the U.S. We have that issue in the U.S. as well. Our textbooks are a political battleground. They should not be. Truth is sometimes hard to find, but not on issues like this, or on the issue of the genocide of Native Americans, for example, in the U.S. We need to acknowledge those truths and the dark side of our histories forthrightly. And then, engage in broader consultation with the affected groups, because that's the main problem here. There have been these half-hearted apologies from Japan, but they're an apology with one hand and then an equivocation on the other hand. It's literally one hand and the other hand. So they'll say, we're sorry, but it really wasn't our fault. There was no coercion. So, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe needs to say that I refute my former statements that there was no coercion. Of course there was coercion here. Of course there was forced labor. And we are sincerely sorry as an official matter, not with our cabinet secretary or spokesman, but from the Prime Minister. I myself am saying that. For him to do that would be an extremely effective and potent symbolic act of a leader that could make a huge difference in this. It could reset, as you say, the entire relationship and put the potential for progress on many fronts on a much firmer footing. Korea, I'm glad that President Park has made this an issue. I think that she's, as a woman, I have no doubt that she feels this viscerally herself. So she should continue to keep the focus on the issue, but again, not use it to pander to the extreme right of her constituency. As a leader, she needs to bring people together and avoid this problem that we actually frankly have in Korea, which is that sometimes human rights are political football. Human rights are universal. They should not be ascribed only to the victims of North Korea or to Japan. They apply here at home as well. The Seoul disaster, I think that it could have been more effectively addressed had there been attention to labor rights so that the workers weren't on temporary contracts, so that there was attention to true principles of accountability, transparency, non-corruption. There were bribes paid in that case, and as a result, safety regulations weren't followed. These are global values, and the reason they're global values, Scott, is that they work in practice. They're the product of millennia of wisdom that have been crystallized in instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like the Treaty Network, like the principles of the UN Global Compact, which relate to business and human rights. So I think that Korea could do a better job of making sure that in this case, on this issue and so many issues, that it actually takes reform seriously, that we have Korea living up to its potential to be the leader that it can and it must be for the interest of Korea, the region, and the world.
We are seeing, as you mentioned earlier, some international movement on this issue. We all hope, of course, that it is resolved soon and the justice that these victims so much deserve is finally given to them. Professor Pitts, thank you very much for being here, providing your insights on this very complicated and emotional issue. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.
We will continue to do our best to improve our show based on the perspective of our viewers. Always feel free to leave us any comments, great ideas, or suggestions you wish to share with us.